your commission? You mean even when you were getting out, you figured you'd go back in?
Yeah. This always bothered me, and I never told too many people. But I was one of the first, what you call reduction in force, RIFT.
Oh, I see.
You were RIFT. And I always felt it was very unfair. This is a lot of personal things, and I've never told a lot of people about this. I guess I'll have to blank that on the tape. It was kind of I felt ashamed. Although I knew the circumstances, I wasn't in problems or anything, but what it was, to show you how I got to, let's go back to over Jamachi. Okay, I was an infantry officer on temporary duty with the 674. And down at the jump school was Lieutenant Yangdowski. He was on temporary duty from 674 down to the jump school. Well, when I left talking, I was telling about getting in being reduction in force, and how I got to be a master sergeant. While I was home, my brother was there, and he'd been in the Army Air Corps during World War II, and he wasn't married then, and he was home with Mom, and so I wanted to get him back in the service. He was worrying Mom. He had a job out at the Pittsburgh Plate Company, but it wasn't, and he was running around with a guy who I didn't care much about. Too much drinking. And so I remember one day he was upstairs in his bedroom, and I was sitting at the head of the stairs talking to him, and we were talking about, and he was combing his hair. And old Duke, his name's Don, but his nickname's Duke. Duke threw his comb down. He says, "Oh hell, I'm going back in the Army." And I just went downstairs and smiled at Mom. And so he went back in the service, and eventually the Air Force, and retired as a tech sergeant. And he married a woman down there and had 3 children. And problem of now, he's got lung cancer, and he doesn't have too much longer to go. And but he's had a good life. And
where is he now?
Panama City.
Oh,
Panama City, Florida. And so we were down there in January, and he's like me, you know. I've had bypasses from smoking Camel cigarettes for years, and I got 4 bypasses. And Duke, he smoked cigarettes, and I used to try to get him to quit when I saw him 5 years ago, and he wouldn't do it. And his first message to me when he told me the bad news, he says, "Well, they finally caught up with me," meaning those cigarettes. Huh? Well, anyhow. Well, I went back in. He went back in, and I think he went back in as a sergeant or a corporal. And I went from Mount Vernon down to the 3rd Armored Division at Fort Knox. And the personnel officer there at the 3rd Armored Division wanted me to go to Fort Benning and go to motor school, because I had attended motor school at Fuchinobi, which is not too far from
Fuchinobi?
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I spent a lot of time at Fuchinobi. Yeah, I used to have military working dogs there, sentry dogs.
Oh, is that right?
Doctor there.
That was 8th Army maintenance school. 2 months. I was there in the summer of 46. And so he said, "Well, you go down to Fort Benning and attend their motor school, and you come back. We're going to start a motor school, and I'll put you in charge." Well, I went down to Fort Benning, and I honchoed around 100 listed men of varying ranks, some National Guard. One of them was 14 years old. And he came there for his training for motor school. Well, I went back to Fort Knox, and the personnel officer never became head of the motor school. And so I heard that they were teaching air transportability over at the armored school, where they trained tank school. And so I went over there and saw a captain, and he said, "Well, we got this master sergeant in charge. He's a former airborne. He's teaching it." And I'd had some air transportability training at Yamota, because we taught a course there. And so I ended up going over there and teaching air transportability. Mainly mock-ups, loading vehicles into mock-ups of planes like C-119s, and I guess that was it. Some of the larger planes hadn't come along. And
Where are we now?
at Fort Knox.
Fort Knox.
Yeah.
Okay, that's right.
Fort
Okay,
Knox.
excuse me.
And we lived there I lived there in the barracks. I was still single, in those old brick buildings there that most older Army posts had. They're real nice. And so one day, in the middle of 48, I went up to the PX, and there I met a captain who I knew in Japan at the jump school, and he was in the reserve section of the Army up at Louisville, Kentucky. And also up there was Colonel O'Kane, who was my CO, or one of my COs while I was at the jump school at Yamato. And so I talked to this captain, and I forget his name, but he said, why don't you put in for active duty? And he says, they're starting to call people back in. And he said, see, by this time things had started heating up in Europe, see, and with the Russians. And he says, I know Colonel O'Kane will endorse it. And so, to make a long story short, I put it in, and I went back on active duty in...
Oh, you were in the reserve, some kind of reserve status there for a while?
No, I was regular Army, listed man.
Right.
I was regular
You went back. You went back on active duty as an officer.
Yeah, but I was a reserve. I was never a regular Army officer. I was always a reserve officer.
Okay.
Always a reserve.
Okay. So
I tried for the regular
So
Army.
you
one
applied
time.
for the regular Army at this point.
No. I was applying to go back on active duty.
I thought you were on. I'm sorry, I'm confused. I thought you were on active duty as a master sergeant.
I was, but you have to be discharged from that.
Okay.
And then go back.
Okay.
Then go back on active duty.
Okay. As an officer.
As an officer.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want the serial numbers?
Huh?
No.
No.
Well, let me give them to you.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, enlisted man was RA15015-009, and as an officer it was 01038-011. Actually, you see how civilians, I never would say how you become like a civilian. Civilians always say O, in the Army you always said 0. As a number was called 0. That's a 0.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Well, those are my serial numbers.
Okay, so you applied to go back on active duty
Yeah.
as an officer.
As an officer.
Okay, and
As
then
a first lieutenant.
you'd be discharged as an enlisted man,
Right.
and then re-sworn in as an officer.
No, they didn't swear me in.
No, they didn't.
No.
You weren't re-sworn.
No. Just had orders. My orders came in orders came in the last of September, and it said that you are to return to active duty as a first lieutenant of infantry and assigned to Trust Command in Trieste. I thought, where is Trust? Well, it just so happened that there was a master sergeant who lived in our squad room, and he had been there and he knew. And Trieste, Italy, is right next door
I
to
know
Yugoslavia.
Yep.
And so then I went home on leave, spent all 10 days in bed with throat problems, strep throat, lost 30 pounds. I was in bad shape.
Great leave, huh?
Oh. And went back to Fort Knox, changed my clothes. Well, I had my officer's clothes still at home. Changed my clothes and got on the train and went to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. And then from there, which is near New Brunswick, New Jersey. And then from there, I went by boat for another 14 days to Trieste. We stopped in Naples en route.
You spent a lot of time on boats, huh?
And seasick all the time. That's why we've been on several cruises, and those little patches behind the ear, that's what old Hobler puts on the first thing. And I can sit on the back of a boat on a cruise, going up and down, eating and reading. I would have never been able to do that. And it doesn't even bother me. Some joker will say, oh, it's psychology. It's not.
Oh, no, I've been seasick. There's nothing psychology about it. It's physical.
It is.
So you got to Trieste.
Okay, went to Trieste. I was still infantry, and I assigned to Company I of the 351st Infantry Regiment. That was a regiment the only regiment there at Trieste. Trieste is trust. That stands for, let's see. Trieste, United States Troop Command. What it was actually a United Nations command.
Mm-hmm.
There were supposed to be 5,000 troops there and 5,000 British. And it had belonged to Italy. After World War I, Italy got control of that. And it had been Austrian before. And then because of the fighting between the Nazi or the fascists and the Yugoslavic guerrillas, and the Yugoslavic guerrillas were in there for about 40 days. UN command, and so we were under the UN. We had we had a major generals in charge of the troops, but the British officer, he was the chief one. But that's the way they set it other place. If the chief honcho was British, the American would be the next in command. If the British American was the chief honcho in another area, it'd be the British would be second in command. Well, I ended up there out the troops were out at Sistiana, Italy, which is out near the Trieste, the Trust Italy border, and And there was just one company out there, lived in no hotel. The officers lived up the hill in a villa. And so I was there for 3 months, I believe, something like that. And one day, we got to Trieste the day before Christmas of '48. And then we had to go through an orientation period, and then we were assigned to our battalions, and then I got out there, I guess, probably in the end of January of '49. And I was there about 3 or 4 months, and then Lieutenant Kuchera came back one day from downtown, and he knew I'd had some MP duty with 11th Airborne at the jump school. He said, "Hey, they're looking for an MP officer." And, the company commander we had and the battalion commander, I didn't get along too well with. And so I thought, well, this is a good way to get out from under their control. The reason the battalion commander was on my rear end was that he had all of these, his name was Durrett Townsend. He's dead now. You wonder how I remember this. I take the ROA magazine, and they had that list on the back of people that died, and I don't think there's too many Durrett Townsends in the world. But we had a lot of fun with that first name of his. But he was what do you call a person? He was a hard nose, a super hard nose. And he'd have these guys in the infantry there. They had just certain numbers of things that they could keep in their footlocker. All their other clothing and gear had to be stored up. Some of them hid them up in the grape harbors that were up behind on the hill behind the hotel, or up in the attic. And so I talked to Davidson about. That wasn't soldiering. That was harassment. And so Davidson, I guess he thought, "Boy, I'm going to get Hobler." He said, "Why don't you ask Colonel Townsend someday about it?" And so after we went through there, and up until then, when he made a platoon inspection, he always inspected us on Friday because the other 3 companies were down at the concern in Trieste. He inspected us on Friday and them on Saturday. So when he got through, he'd always stop and tell you, it looks good. Up until then, old Hobler had high marks. And so this day I said, "Colonel Townsend, can I ask you something?" "Sure, Lieutenant, what can I ask you?" So I said, "These men have all this stuff that they have to hide before they come for inspection." I said, I don't think it's fair." Man, he blew up. And I don't think he even returned my salute. He went on up the stairs. There were circular stairs going up the next floor, and I could hear him yakking all the way up. Well, from then on, when he came to inspect Hobler, I had it. And that's why I transferred really to the MPs, was to get away from him. And I put in a letter to go to transfer. I went down, was interviewed by the provost marshal, and he accepted me. Then I put in an order, and then I went back to when I put the letter in, I had to go through channels. I had to get his endorsement. Well, he was up in the field having a CPX and command post exercise. And so I told him what I wanted to do, and he said, well, I'm not going to approve it. He said, I've got plans for you, Lieutenant. Those were his exact words. And I thought, boy, I bet you have. Well, anyhow, to make a long story short, the captain down there was in with Smiley, Colonel Whitlaw. We called him Smiling Jack, because he never smiled. And you know, Smiling Jack used to be a cartoon?
No.
Old-time cartoon, an aviator. But he's called Smiling Jack. But anyhow, he saw Smiling Jack, who was chief of staff, and when you're chief of staff, you can do whatever you want to. Smiling Jack says, cut the orders. Next thing I knew, I thought I had it. I had orders to go to the 281st Military Police Service Company, which was downtown in Trieste. And I went down there and stayed there until I rotated home the 31st of January of 52. I was there most of 49, 50, and 51. And while I was there, I was a stockade officer 18 months at different times. I had the MP company for a year, and I would have I'd have had a thing, but a lieutenant, West Pointer, Don Byers, he made captain ahead of me, and so he took over the company. And so I was exec officer at different times, and supply officer, and mess officer, payroll officer, troop information officer. And but when I wasn't working over in the company as a company commander, I was at the stockade. And we usually had about 50 prisoners. Most of them were ones that had been sentenced by special court-martial to 6 2/3, 6 months in the stockade, 2/3 of their pay for 6 months. We also held people who were tried by general court until they were shipped home on a boat. And
You were company commander, though, eventually.
for my career, you want me to run down through that?
No. I mean, when you were in Trieste, you were
Well,
company commander for a company of military policemen.
yeah. I was a platoon leader for several in I Company of the 351st.
Right.
And then when I went down to Trieste at the MP Service Company, the 281st, and incidentally, we have reunions now with the 281st. We've had 2 of them, and it's really great to see all the guys, and a lot of them married Trieste girls, and they get together and have a big time. And so from about April until 49 till January of 50, I was a company commander, and then from about January.
So did you get promoted to captain then?
No.
You're as company commander as lieutenant, first lieutenant. Huh?
Right.
Okay.
And but it calls, for a captain. And then from January of 51 until I came home, I was back over at the stockade. It was over at the palace just across the street.
Oh, and the West Pointer took over the company.
Yeah, he took over.
Okay.
He's now retired up in Washington, and they call him Mr. Volvo because Don, after he got out, he retired as lieutenant colonel. He had a Volvo dealership up there and made a lot of money. He was always into cars. He was I remember he had a 48 Club coupe, 2-door coupe, Chevrolet, that he rebuilt there in Trieste. He even had a 2.5-ton motor in this car, and he had to have a new camshaft and all that put in there, And when I left there in January of 52, he had purchased a Ferrari, and it was as long as that dining room there. But when you sat in it, your feet was like that, It wasn't for a family; it was for a bachelor. But he was married; he had a family. Well, he left Trieste. He went to West Point, and they made him sell that car. And it made old Don Sinat. He went out and bought a motorcycle. You can imagine an officer driving around on a motorcycle. In those days they were frowned on it because it was like carrying an umbrella. You didn't carry an umbrella. That's one thing I like about being a civilian. Boy, when I get out,
I never could understand that.
Yeah.
prohibition on wearing on umbrellas.
Yeah.
It just seems so dumb. When I'm standing out in the rain, I always think, geez, why don't...
Today I think of that every time I put an umbrella.
So then you left in 52, January 52, and went back to the States?
Yeah, and I went back. I had orders to go. Of course, I went back. That was TDY, temporary duty as an MP officer. I wore the cross pistols, but then I had to put the cross rifles back on because I went back to the infantry. And I left, went home on leave, and then to Mount Vernon. And then I was assigned to, as a company commander, eventually to the 5th Infantry Division at Indiantown Gap, which is located near Harrisburg. And I was with the 2nd Regiment, Company I, 2nd Regiment. And we trained mainly basics to go overseas. And so, again, old Hobler hadn't seen combat.
So you were a company commander, though?
Yeah, I was company commander.
Of infantry now?
Right.
At Indiantown Gap,
Right.
training to go over to Korea?
Either that or to Europe.
Oh, training to go somewhere?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was always interesting. On the day that they graduated, we had tables, the old company table out in the company street. And if you were going to Europe, why, you went to that table. If you were going to Japan, well, they still had a few troops there in Japan, over there. Or if you're going to Panama, you went over here or someplace in the States. And those kids stood there, and most of them were just out of high school. But boy, when they got going to Europe, they'd zoom over there to that table, happy as they could be. But when they said Korea, they just dragged their feet going over there because they were going to combat. Who blamed them? Well, old Hobler hadn't been to combat yet, so I got the bug to go to Korea. So in the summer of 52, I went down to Washington, D.C. to see a buddy of mine, he and his wife, who I knew in Trieste, Jack Hill, now a retired colonel up here in Yorktown, Pennsylvania. And I've known them ever since 49. And actually, in a lot of ways, they're closer to me than my brothers and sisters, because I was around them more than I was, I was in the Army. Well, anyhow, I went down there and went out to check my records at the Pentagon, and then I talked to a man there about going to Korea. He said, well, they've got a regulation now that you have to be 6 months in the States before you can go to Korea. And so I said, okay. So I went back to Indiantown Gap. I counted the days, and as soon as that 6 months was up, I put in a letter through channels to the Army at the Pentagon for Korea. I got a copy of it back there. A lot of people don't believe me, a guy volunteering to go to combat. And so then my orders came through, but it said that I had to go to Fort Benning and go through a company officer's course, which was 4 months long. And so from November until, till around the 1st of March.
This is now 53.
Yeah,
March
53. I went to Benning and went through the company officer's course down there, which is weapons and all kinds of classes and things. And then I got on another leave and went home and flew up to Madison, Wisconsin. At that time, Jack and D. Hill had been, he was up there working with the University of Wisconsin Army Reserves. And then I went on out to Camp Stoneman. And then I got on
Which is where?
Right outside Frisco.
Oh, okay.
It was kind of between Frisco and Fort Ord.
Okay.
Camp Stoneman. And I was there, and I heard they were flying people to Korea. So I went up to the personnel officer and said, sorry, we're only flying, what was it, 1542 was the MOS for officers, lieutenants. And I was a captain. I'd been promoted to captain in July of 51 there at Trieste. And even though I was a captain, I was junior, and they just kept me there because they knew in a few months I was going to rotate home. So I was the exec officer and there at Trieste and in charge of the stockade. Well, I was at Camp Stoneman, and then I got on another boat there in Frisco, another 14 days, and went to Japan, at Yokohama, out at Camp Zama again. And there they packed all of our civilian clothes in foot lockers or bags and get them ready so that if you got killed in Korea, I even put my mom's address on it, see. So if you got killed in Korea, they shipped that stuff on home. And then we drew combat gear except weapons. And then we went by train down to Sasebo in southern Japan, stayed there a couple of days, then went by boat over to Busan, Korea, and stayed there a couple of days, then went by train up to Seoul, and there at a replacement company, and then went by train so far up into Korea, and then by truck, and I was assigned to the 7th Infantry Division, and in the 9th Corps area, and we had some orientation there, went out and visited the front, the MLR, the main line of resistance, and things like that. Then I was sent to the 17th Infantry Regiment, and then the colonel sent me over to Colonel A. Cuff, who was the 1st Battalion commander of the 1st Battalion of the 17th Regiment. And he sent me over to Dog Company, which is D Company, a heavy weapons company. And so from that time until around the 20th of July, Hobler had his combat. And heavy weapons company...
This is now from when to when?
About end of April to the middle of July of 53.
Okay, April to July 53.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in the heavy weapons company, you had 4 81 millimeter mortars and 4 heavy the old water-cooled Browning machine guns, plus some air-cooled machine guns. And then the acute weapon was the 75 recoilless rifle, which was an unusual weapon. You know, you could fire on your shoulder if you could hold it, because the blast went out the rear. Later on, they had a 105, which was the same way, but it was mounted on the Jeep. Prior to that, they had a 57 recoilless rifle, which they first used in Okinawa in the battle in World War II. And you could hold that on your shoulder and fire because it wasn't too heavy. But the blast went out the rear and the shell went that way. And so the main fighting I got into, although we were shelled and so forth, and I came under fire sometime and made old Hobler happy, but later on I realized how dumb it was the Battle of Pork Chop, which took place from the 5th to the 11th of July. And my heavy weapons company supported all the attacks on Pork Chop, using mainly, we fired about 14,000 rounds of varying, like HE and WP, white phosphorus, and a lot of machine guns, because the machine guns were located down on a ridge which covered the rear end of Pork Chop. And then 75s, we used that in bunker destroying, mainly. Well, it was, I'd be up on this ridge, which was right over here, Pork Chop was over here, and I'd back on this ridge. And they would call to me and tell me where Joe Chink, we never said Chinese, it was always Chink, Joe Chink. And we knew we had the bunkers numbered, and the ones that were on the reverse side of the slope faced me. And so I had a map, and they'd say, well, the Chinks are in that bunker. And so I had a gunner from Cleveland, a Polish boy, Ski, as I remember. He could hit anything. And so I'd call Ski in the command bunker, which is up on the ridge, and I had to have that because I had to put my binoculars in the aperture of the bunker. And I would lay on the binoculars, the Army binocular scale in there in the binoculars. I'd lay that. I'd say, now look at 10. It's on bunker, say 52. You're to aim there. And so we'd knock out the Chinks that way. In one of them, I had a warrant officer who was assigned to the company. I never knew how he got assigned there because the warrant officers weren't on the company roster, on the TO&E, the Tables of Organization and Equipment. But anyhow, he was looking one day when we were destroying these bunkers, and he saw these two chinks standing in the door smoking a cigarette. And they were up above the infantry, which was fighting up the hill, see, and they were standing up there smoking their cigarette, standing in the door. They heard this 75 round coming, and I had a 76. The Chinese fired 76s, and I had a 76 fired at me one day, and I know what it sounds like, because I was, well, that's another story. But anyhow, these two chinks heard this round coming. They ran back in the bunker, shut the door, and the round went right through the door. And, you know, man, you can imagine the explosive. But before the pork chop fighting started, they requested someone to come down and a captain and replace the captain who had headquarters company of the division. Well, I was the only captain, only company commander who was a captain. All the others were First Johns. Yeah, that went tight. And so before the pork chop started, I went down there and was interviewed, and I told him I didn't want that job. I went around with the guy, and I thought, boy, what a mess this is, you know. You ever been around division headquarters? Bunch of prima donnas. And anyhow, I went back up, and pork chop started, and I didn't hear anything more about it. And of course, they kept me there because of the fighting. And so when the war was over, I thought, well, I'm home free. I'll still be up here. But here came the orders. And so I left about the 20th of July of '53 and went down and took over the headquarters company, which I had until I came home in May, first part of May of '54. You just stayed about a year in Korea.
While you were in Korea, did you take any prisoners? Chinese prisoners or Korean
No,
prisoners?
the only thing that was unusual like that, we did some sweeps sometimes with patrols on ridges around my company, because some of the artillery fire that came into our area was so accurate. Now, of course, they can, if you fire artillery and have it zeroed in, your gun zeroed in by, well, you know, like what do you call it when they, it's the same principle as marking off a lot. You know, how they, if you're going to sell a lot, they'll come out and what's that called? Well, the guns are laid in, and you can fire by maps if you have the guns laid correctly and pinpoint pretty much the artillery fire. Now, on mortars, if you can see where a mortar round lands, an observer can adjust on that. But some of the mortar fire that we got was so doggone accurate, we felt that there was a chink up there on the hill, or some Korean was directing it by radio. So we did some patrolling in that. But right down this next door to me was a Korean company of workers. They called them KSCs. They worked, dug trenches and repaired roads and things like that. And one day, the interpreter came over there, and he was all beat up. Someone had beat him around the face. And he said to me in so many words, and he also spoke pretty good English, that there were some people over there whose papers were not correct in that company. In other words, they were not verified Koreans, maybe line crossers, you know. And so I went over to the S2 and reported it. Next thing you know, why, here comes some jeeps and from the counterintelligence corps, and they came up there, and when they got through interviewing those people, why, about 4 or 5 Koreans took off in the back of a jeep. And I said to the lieutenant who was S2, I said, what do you think will happen to him? He said, you won't see him again. Meaning, you know. But what I did then after that, although we had guards out at night, I went out and had them put in between that camp and our camp tent stakes. And then I had them make a webbing of barbed wire so that no one could crawl or could run through it. And that's about the only thing that... and we had Korean soldiers that were assigned to each company, and they did real well. And you got real attached to them. They're very friendly people.
Did you have much to do during your career, and maybe even back into Trieste time? Did you have much to do with Allied soldiers? You mentioned British.
Yeah, we had a little bit of contact with them.
Any impressions there?
Yeah, well, when I was with the infantry, Colonel Townsend a couple times had, we had what you call a sister battalion, and we would invite all those officers over to our club and our battalion club and give them this big feed. I mean, the table, I got pictures of it back there, the amount of food that we would give them. And they would come and drink up a storm, and the British can really drink. And yet, when it was their turn to have a party, they would only invite the company commanders and the battalion commanders, all those lieutenants, first lieutenants. If you weren't on the battalion staff, well, I forget it. So we acted so badly about the third time that happened. We used to stand back and let them come up and get in the front of the line, to go through the line. A lot of us got together and would push our way up. We acted so badly that fell through. There weren't too many parties after that between the British. I would go to their shows a lot. They were invited to our shows, meaning the movies. Well, I never liked to sit next to a Britisher because he smelled. They don't take baths like we do. And at least they didn't that time, and I understood that's quite common. American, if I don't take a shower at night, well, I feel I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
They were very friendly people. The Italians were the ones we had more contact with. I dated an Italian girl. I was going to marry her, and then found out that she was running around with naval officers after she was wearing my ring. And so I had to break that off. And a lot of guys, and like I said, we get together with them maybe once every 2 or 3 years. And I enjoyed the service there in Trieste. I don't know whether you've ever been to Trieste, but it's a beautiful city. It was rarely, the only bombing it got was during World War II. When I was there was a ship called the Rex. It was an Italian liner that was sunk. It was lying on its side out in the harbor. And then also they tried to bomb the fascist headquarters, and the stick of bombs went over the headquarters and landed in a bunch of old medieval tenant buildings. And when they cleared it off, there below it was a beautiful Roman theater that they didn't even know was there. And it's there today.
That's interesting.
And but we had a lot of problems while we were there with the communists trying to start riots, and that was handled though mainly by the British and the Venetia Giulia police. The Venetia Giulia, that's the name of that peninsula where Trieste is, and so they handled that. But we were kind of a backup, and we would mainly our patrols, the MPs would go out on a day when the communists were acting up, and tell where crowds were gathering, and it would go into one headquarters so they would know which way to send the troops, if they had to send them out.
Did you have, excuse me, did you have any contact with the Allied troops in Korea, the Turks, or?
Yeah, wait a minute.
Whoever.
To our battalion, to our regiment, there was a Colombian regiment.
Colombian?
Colombian.
Oh.
And the only thing I remember about them was that to take a bath, we had to go all the way back to headquarters. And by the time you came up on the dusty roads, it was just like you didn't have a bath. So what I'd do, I'd go down and take a bath in a stream. And it was located back behind the Colombians, which were over on my right.
Yes, sir.
And a couple of times I had to run out of the stream because those yahoos were shooting rifles down into that area. And this is behind the line of resistance, supposed to be friendly troops. I talked to a friend of mine, Lieutenant Alvarez, who was, of course, he spoke Spanish, and he was over there later on as a liaison. He said, you can't blame those poor kids. He said most of those kids came right out of the hills and never had a pair of shoes on until they joined the Colombian Army. And we moved into an Ethiopian area that had been there one time. Ethiopians had been there. You had to watch them because they booby-trapped everything. And we had to be real careful where we moved until we cleared an area. And They were great fighters, though. I remember they were over in Yoke and Uncle, which were outposts. This took place in May or June of '53, and there was a big battle over there on Yoke and Uncle, and we were over in Erie and Arsenal, which were two outposts coming off the main line of resistance. We called over there and said, "Do you need any help?" They said, "No, we'll take care of it," and they did. I read the after-action report later on, and it's really something. They never waited for the Chinks to get to them. They would pick up their machine guns and move right down the hill. Americans would never do that. Or if they got a hold of a Chink, they'd cut his head off and throw the head back into the Chink troops. That's not stories, that's true. That's not something made up. They were great fighters.
Ethiopians, huh?
Yeah.
So you left Korea in March '54, May '54, what? May
'54.
May '54.
Yeah.
Okay. And then your career continued another about 6 years.
Yeah.
Until you retired in
January in 1961. 61.
And where did just briefly, where did you serve in that 6-year period?
Okay.
You were an infantry officer the whole time. You were eventually promoted to major.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I came back from Korea in May of '54. I had leave at Mount Vernon. Then I had orders to go to Benning to take the advanced infantry training course. So I went down there for 4 months, and then I knew I was going to the 11th Airborne Division. I was assigned the 11th Airborne Division, and I went up to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, which is near Clarksville. And when I went there, I did some umpire duty on combat infantry training tests, and then I was assigned to support company, the 188 Airborne Infantry Regiment. And I had that until several months later. I was transferred as S4 supply officer of the 1st Battalion of the 188. While I was there, I met my wife, Pat Kennedy, and we dated for about a year, and then they started to talk about Gyro of the 11th Airborne to Germany to replace the, I think it was 8th Division. Well, to make a long story short, we got orders to Gyro, but we went ahead and got married in February the 11th of 1956, and there was some question there whether she could go with me or not, and it was on and off. And so I'd already found another job on post with a friend of mine, and then I got orders to go to Germany. And so I went to Germany by 10 days vote over there. They cleaned out the stockades at Fort Bragg and Fort Campbell because they had to go at 110%, you know. And so they cleaned the stockades out, and guess who honchoed them? Captain Hobler on the boat. But they had a lot of good officers and NCOs, so I didn't have any problem. And we went over there, and I went to near Augsburg, Germany. Well, I lived in Augsburg. Pat came over in April of '56, and a few months later. And so I was S4 of the 1st Battalion. Then they decided to go by battle, and so I ended up in the 2nd Battle Group of the 504th Infantry Airborne Infantry Battalion, 504th Infantry Battle Group there in Augsburg at Reese Caserne. And there I was the S2, the intelligence officer. And I went a couple times down to Oberammergau to intelligence school and nuclear training. And so later on, they deactivated the 11th Airborne, and we ended up being the 19th Infantry of the 24th Infantry Division. The sad part about it, we were legs again. No more good jump pay. And so, well, we got by. And so while we were there, we tried to have children, and we didn't have any success. So well, it was a long story of visitations here and there, and Pat made them while I was on duty, and then we'd visit different homes. And we finally adopted a little girl, and her name is Jenny K. Krista Hobler Boyd, and she was born on the 17th of December, 1957. And so when I was S2 then for 2 years, and finally I got orders to first to go to a reserve unit in Nashville, and then they changed it, and I went to the 77 Special Forces at Fort Bragg, and while I was there, I was supposed to be an intelligence officer because I had that MOS. And in talking to the personnel officer the day I got there, he saw I'd been a supply officer. And so back into supply, Hobler went. School that all officers for Special Forces have to go through. And then I was promoted in December of '59 to major. And then I took over a company. And let's see, on the TO&E, the Table of Organization Equipment, for a Special Forces company at that time called for a lieutenant colonel.
Oh, all right.
That's right. You had, the company was made up of a company and so many B teams, and then in each team, B team, there was so many A teams. Of course, they were all specially trained, cross-trained, in medics, weapons, communication, demolitions, what have you. And then because I did a little bit on my university training, more going to, well, I took some university training at Austin P and a little bit at the University of Maryland extension courses while I was in Augsburg. And because I didn't go on and complete it, why, I know that's the reason why they put me on retirement. Because in '59, the lieutenant colonel who rated me, he said, "Aren't you taking any more of that training?" I said, "No." I said, "I'm going to wait a little while," or some excuse like that. And so I guess they figured, well, if old Hobler's not going to try to extend his education, why, we don't need him. Because I know a lot of people who went on bootstrap, out in Omaha, and they went on and completed their training, their 30 years as reserve people, and made colonel. But I had no objection. I always felt the Lord wanted it that way, because I retired, came home to Knoxville. I always came here because I liked Knoxville, first time I saw it. And I'm one of those Yankees who, when I served in the South, I said, I would never live in the South or marry a Southerner.
And you did.
And you know the old saying, never say never, which I did both. And so then I came back here, and I took a year's extension course on hotel training, worked at night on it. And so I went into hotel training, and I was the night manager down here at then the Andrew Johnson Hotel, across from the old courthouse building. It then was a first-class hotel owned by the Reynolds Tobacco Company. And I was night manager there. And around about June, we were visiting a guy that married us. He was a retired naval commander, chaplain, and he had retired because of heart trouble, and he was here in Knoxville. And we was out there one night. He said, "Why don't you go back to school under the GI Bill?" And I said, "Go back to school? I'm 40 years old." And he told me about, the Korean Bill. Well, at the time I went back, the Korean Bill, the World War II Education Bill had run out. So I went back under the Korean Bill. And so I started in September of '61 and actually finished all my courses by July of '64, but I didn't graduate till August because they only had one time, in the summer. But by that time, I had been interviewed by Bill Turner, who was a longtime principal at Bearden High School, and he accepted me as a teacher, and I went there and taught social studies, mainly American government, economics, civics. I taught 1 year as American history, and then I became the head of the social studies department until I retired in January of '83. And
So you've been retired the second time for quite a while now.
yes, 13 years, and the best years of my life. I do what I want to. I do volunteer work. I've been elder at the Aaron Presbyterian Church 3 or 4 times I'm going to go back on again for a year to finish up a term, another person who transferred. And I did work on child abuse, tried to get an organization started on that. I also worked for 5 years on Congregations for Drug-Free County. I was the vice president of that. And we finally went inactive on that because we could not get the churches here in Knoxville interested in it. And what we did, we did it on an individual basis where the congregations, individual members of the congregation would donate $20 a year. Just think of that, a bag full of groceries for $20 a year. And then people that were involved in units, organizations that were involved, or agencies involved in fighting drugs or the drug problem, they would put money in for grants. And in the 5 years, well, maybe more like 4 years, we gave over $20,000 in grants. Like to, for example, the Sheriff's Department, we gave them $1740 so they could buy a computer and so they could keep track of the drugs that were in their evidence room. And of course I went down there and they did a good job with it. They were also keeping track of other evidence. We gave a lot of organizations. And they had to put in a grant, and it had to be passed on. But we could never get we never got more than 10 churches. And they were mainly Methodist and Presbyterian, one Christian church. Couldn't get the Baptists. They would never do it.
Let me ask you one other question. And
Sure.
I think, well, maybe two actually. Think about it. Did you had obviously service during the Second World War and the Korean War. Did you have any personal feelings about men of those era, the World War II era and then later the Korean War era, who didn't serve? Did you have any strong feelings one way or another? Old George, neighbor's son.
Florence, you mean?
Well, no, not. Well, if there was somebody who didn't serve for some reason, whatever it happened. I mean, obviously, if somebody was missing an eye or something.
Oh, sure.
You couldn't. But were there people who were like draft dodgers? To use that kind of term.
Yeah.
That's a generic term for somebody who really tried to avoid service. Did you have any hard feelings about that, or even people who were in the service, maybe, who went to extremes to try to avoid going into combat or always tried to feather their own nest,
During World War II, I don't remember of any. I always it was universal. They referred to them as 4Fs, because they couldn't pass a physical. They drafted, as far as I know, fathers during World War II. I know they drafted them up to 46 because when I was in OCS, I was 22, but we called him Pop. He was 46 years old, gray hair.
He was in OCS also?
Yeah, he was in OCS. And there was another guy, a buddy of his, almost the same age. And then there were a lot of World War I officers, reserve officers that came back and served in World War II, but usually administrative or non-combat job. But I never had any ill feelings about those people. There was always, and the same way, the only thing that always bothered me was a situation I had there at when I was at Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, and had these people going through training. We had, there were two kids, I call them kids because they were in their early 20s or they had been drafted. And one of them, his father, as far as I remember, was a labor organizer of some labor organization in New York. And I know from what I heard and the way this kid was always trying to, I had to give him a pass one time when he didn't earn it. You could, if they had so many demerits, you could cut their pass. And I had to give him a pass one time when he didn't deserve it. Why? Because I got a call from regimental headquarters telling me I'd better do it. And then later on, he worked around and got that kid assigned, I know, to, I don't know whether he stayed in the States or went to Europe.
So there was some favoritism.
Yes.
That Yeah, you don't like that.
And later on, I met this father. After they had shipped out, I was going up to the mess hall, and Lord, here he came walking down the street, and I had met him before, and I had nothing but pure contempt for him. I don't think I ever showed it, because I think of it like water off a duck's back. I wouldn't pay that much attention to him. He was a pusher, you know. And he says, "Oh, I'm going down here to company so-and-so. I got a nephew down here." I thought to myself, that poor company commander has got to put up with you.
Were there any major, I'm thinking of big things now, not little things, but were there any major things you think our country did wrong in the prosecution of either one of those wars?
You mean like the Korean War?
Yeah, either one of them, World War II or Korean War.
Well,
things that we really messed up.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we shouldn't have done that.
During the World War II, everyone was in it, you know, and there was everyone was in the war. It was, you know, it was all fired up. You know, you can see it in a lot of the old movies you see on TV today. But when the Korean War came along, they talked about the opposition to the Vietnam War. There was opposition to the Korean War. You know, they called that Truman's War, and they badmouthed that poor guy, and there were, I don't know whether people then, if you went to college, you were exempt like they did during the Vietnam War. But that was the bad thing about the Vietnam War, was that if you were in a job, you didn't have to go to Vietnam. If you were in college, you didn't have to go to Vietnam. And I think later on, those guys, when they get older, say in my age group, they're going to have some tall explain to do the grandson. Well, Daddy, where were you during the Vietnam War? See? And we had one or two teachers at Bearden that were there. They were draft age. As soon as the war was over, I didn't see them anymore. They were in, okay, see, I'm teaching, so forth.
Oh, you could get a deferment because you were teaching?
I think so, yeah.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. It's like during World War II, you got a deferment if you were a farmer, which, because food was a big thing, you know. Yeah. We had rationing and all kinds of things, you know. Even in the Army in World War II, they'd have number 10 cans, you know what they are. Yeah. And when you left the mess hall, you had to put and the mess sergeant standing there. And you didn't dare to throw away anything, but they always wanted to see, well, how much bread was thrown away, how much meat was thrown away. Trying to analyze to improve on the diet, I guess, or the tasteability of food.
Well, do you have any other comments you want to make to go on this tape for posterity? They're going to go to the Hoskins Library at the University of Tennessee.
Well, I hope I didn't ramble. And
no, it's been a very fruitful discussion.
And the other thing I wanted to say was,
yes, sir.
I always tried to live a Christian life when I was in the Army, and it would. I tried to go to chapel, but then there's a lot of times Hobler went astray, you know, got off the path and sinned. And but since 1954, I've really and more since then, I've really concentrated about being a Christian. And you can be a Christian in military life. And I was in men of the chapel in Europe, just like Pat was in women of the chapel in Germany. And but you can be a Christian, and I try to lead a Christian life. And but it was a good life. See, I enjoyed it. There was a lot of the only thing I didn't like about the Army, and it's in civilian life, and I know in teaching and elsewhere, is the gossiping. You know, if they don't like you, then it's character assassination. Mm-hmm. And I know I've been guilty of that, but since I I rededicated my life as a Christian in '54, and since I taught a unit through Joan Abel was our Christian education director up there in Presbyterian Church. She asked me to do a unit on the Holy Spirit. Well, I'd read about the Holy Spirit, but I really didn't understand who this Holy Spirit was and how he acts. And so I taught it, and it really opened up my eyes. And from then on, I try to live a better life as a Christian. And I just hope that if I had caused any bad feeling or any character assassination myself, because I went through it myself, that I'm forgiven for. And so some of the things I've done, I did another volunteer thing since then, is Christ-oriented, is for Contact. I worked on that for 8 years. And that's answering the telephone. You don't try to send out of people, but if the word gets around to talking about Christ and his promise, why you talk to them.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. And, people call in. Do you know what Contact is? Have you ever heard of it?
Yes, yes.
And you talk to people and you lend a listening ear, and you don't judge or you don't advise them unless they ask on it, but mainly you give them telephone numbers to organizations that will help them. And so I did the child abuse thing and the drug thing and I did a little tutoring for a while up at Knoxville College, and that didn't last very long because the woman that was there, her husband got ill and she had to leave. She was retired also. He was retired. Something kind of comical here about him was, while she was teaching these kids, on English, he was also working there at the Knoxville College. And he had been a professor at universities out in the Midwest. And so one day they had all these lawnmowers there that wouldn't operate, those old 1.5 horsepower Briggs Stratton motors. And so he said, well, I'll work on it. They said, well, doctor said, you know how to do that? And he laughed. What it was, he had worked on some of the big engines that they used to, and I guess improved on them or invented them on the wheat fields of the plains area, And here they were asking him.
So he knew about engines, huh?
I always thought that was a good story. And of course, there's always kinds of stories in the Army, but I'm getting off the track. So what I do now, I take care of Pat. She takes care of me. We got 2 daughters. We adopted another daughter when we came here, we came here in '61, and after I graduated, we adopted another girl. She was 10 days old. No, she was 6. Judy was 6 weeks old when we adopted her. Jenny was 10 days old when we adopted her in Germany. And so they're the light of our lives. And we have a 7-year-old grandson and about a 3-year-old grandson, Jenny, the one we adopted in Germany. And then Judy, she works with the handicap. She's has about a 2-year-old, 3-year-old. She'll be 3 years in April. And then if there's any way I can help people, that's what I believe we're here on earth, is to help people.
Well, I certainly appreciate your help with this interview, and I'm sure the scholars in the future at the University of Tennessee will similarly thank you.
Well, I hope they don't make any comments about that old man rambling around.
No, I'm sure no. So we'll conclude here. It is 1:02 p.m. in the afternoon, and again, my thanks to Mr. Hobler for his assistance, and my thanks on behalf of the University of Tennessee. Thank you, Mr. Hobler.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate
I'm
it.
glad I could do it. Thank you.